All right, I'll go ahead and get started. My name's Jenny Barna. I'm the launch manager at Spire Global, which is one of these new space startups in San Francisco, and I'm lucky to be a part of it. I'm going to be talking a little bit just about who we are, where we came from, what we've got going on now, and where we're going in the future. So like I mentioned, we are one of the lucky few who call ourselves a space startup. The average age is probably 25. I came from Orbital and SSL, and I've worked with some really smart people, done a lot of great things, but I've never been in a room with so many people who are just constantly driving for innovation and doing things differently, and these are some of the smartest people I've ever met. So this is how we got started. It was a handful of students at ISU, International Space University, who had the idea to launch a Kickstarter campaign and crowdfund a satellite. And what their idea was comparable to an iPhone. So just like an iPhone had the hardware platform and a microprocessor and sensors on board, and they kind of opened it up to the global development community to create applications. Our 1U CubeSat, the RUSat satellite that was crowdfunded, was a hardware platform, which was the CubeSat, a microprocessor, 25 sensors, and for $250 a week, student classrooms could log on and upload code, run experiments, have complete access to the payload in space. So 9 months later, that satellite was launched from the International Space Station. We went up on an H-2B Japanese launch vehicle, and about a month later, essentially thrown out the window. That then kind of propelled us forward. We got some seed money in San Francisco. We joined a hardware incubator called Lemnos Labs. And it was just a handful of people at that time. And then we launched a second satellite, actually the third. We threw 2 satellites on that first launch just because nanoracks had extra space. I think that was the story. So we launched a 2U satellite. This one went up on an Orbital Antares and then ejected from the space station using the nanoracks platform. So then came sort of a pivot. It was time to think about what applications we could do on the satellite to turn this from a CubeSat project to a business. So what meaningful applications could we fit onto a 3U CubeSat to generate revenue, to generate investor interest? And at the time, imaging was pretty much saturated. Right around the time we raised money was when Google bought Skybox. Planet Labs was probably in year 2 or 3 of development in San Francisco. And you've seen other companies coming out too doing satellite imaging. So what we're doing is just, it's completely different. It's RF sensors. So this man, Peter Platzer, is one of our founders. He came from Wall Street. So he's a physicist first, and then he went to Harvard to get an MBA. And then he worked on Wall Street and managed, I think he started a $500 million fund that he managed, and he left all of that. So he understands the market very well and what investors are after, what can generate revenue. And this is what he honed in on. 90% of all global trade moves on the back of these container ships over the oceans. And a lot of people want better data, more timely data about where their goods are. So it's not just investors, where kind of he came from and knew that, but insurance companies, shipping companies, cargo, the freight companies that are at the docks, and all kinds of, insurance companies. There's a huge market for more data. Second big payload is weather. So there's not a single privately run weather satellite out there anywhere in the world. And right now, as you see the headlines, we're about to run into a weather gap. So government-funded satellites are behind budget and behind schedule, over budget. So there is going to be a gap. And it's estimated that in the US alone, there's $500 billion worth of impact to our economy. So big businesses, Pepsi, Cola, is willing to pay millions of dollars for weather data and more timely. So we launched into this business with 2 main ideas, right? So weather and maritime domain awareness. So we launched our first prototype of a 3U satellite called Lemur 1 just last year on a NEPR launch vehicle, and that had both of those payloads on it, and that's still in orbit today. And right around the same time, we raised $25 million. So This fueled us to be able to grow our talent. We opened an office in Glasgow, Scotland, started hiring people, bought all of our hardware to be able to launch 20 satellites by the end of this year, 20 ground stations by the end of this year, and operate the first commercial weather constellation, AIS. So by the end of this year, we'll have 20 of those satellites up, and then our goal is a full constellation by the end of 2017, which will be 100 satellites. The other half of the piece, which I mentioned, we often forget about as space people, but we have a global ground station infrastructure. And we've come at this in much of the same way that we approach satellites, which is cheap to build, cheap to operate. Our ground stations are kind of redundant in volume, so we're just deploying many of these ground stations that are inexpensive all over the world. And that provides the low latency data product, the real-time data all over the globe. So putting up 100 CubeSats or 100 satellites into a constellation is not easy, but people understand how to do it. You know what orbital planes you need to get into, you know how to get there, you pay for a launch service, that's easy. Doing it as a secondary CubeSat customer, very, very hard. Spire has a couple great things going for us. This is one, and this does actually help. People answer the phone when they know you just raised $40 million more. Makes my job easier. But the second, and I think this is most important, our payloads are not like other payloads that require a very specific orbit to do their function. We are really only driven by the NOAA rule to deorbit within 25 years. Our AIS payload and our GPS-RO payload can both operate at 500 kilometers, at 600 kilometers, so we're not limited to a specific altitude, which is great because we don't have propulsion, right? And like Planet Labs doesn't have propulsion, so they need to pick launches that are going to exactly where they need to go. So this is a highly convenient aspect of our payloads. And what else is interesting, if you're riding as a secondary, right, you have to just pick launches that have already been predetermined. Someone else already booked the launch, they picked the date, the orbit, everything. So an astrodynamicist at the Aerospace Corporation actually looked at if you put a CubeSat or 2 CubeSats on every single launch going to LEO, what would your constellation look like? And what would your revisit time be with that constellation? Because I can't plan a perfect constellation. I just have to throw CubeSats on every rocket that I get a chance to. Well, it turns out that compared to the perfectly symmetric, perfectly planned out constellation, you would do better with revisit time just chucking 2 CubeSats on every single available LEO launch next year, which is pretty incredible. And it makes you more resilient if there's a launch failure because your constellation isn't perfectly symmetric, if that kind of makes sense. So if a launch fails or if a particular set of satellites fail, no worries. So these are kind of our options on the table today. These are all the launch vehicles that we can go on. So there are a lot of options. And then there are I call them brokers, they don't like that term, the third-party integrators that are very helpful. And today, if you are a CubeSat company and you would like to launch as a secondary customer, you can call them and say, I would like to go to 500 kilometers, next March, do you have anything? How much is it? And you can sign a deal a week later, So it's incredibly convenient to find a launch. The other thing is that we have this dramatically changing launch landscape. Secondary is the new primary. There are companies like Tricept and Spaceflight, which I think you've heard speak at this event, that are buying up large amounts of capacity on launches and reselling that to CubeSat customers or microsat customers, 100 kilogram, 50 kilogram satellites. The picture on the right is a Sherpa ring, which is Spaceflight in Seattle. They booked capacity on a Falcon 9 launch, and they've manifested 87 satellites on that ring. And in the next couple of years, this is the most exciting part if you're a launch manager, these new companies that are going to offer dedicated launch services to small satellites. So rather than ride secondary, I can actually call a rocket company and say, I would like to book a launch to this place on this date. So pictured here, left around to the right, Virgin Galactic will have Launcher 1, so an air-launched launcher. In the middle top, that's the New Zealand company Rocket Lab that Bessemer mentioned that they just invested in. And I think they'll be first to market out of all of these. I think they have a demo launch later this year and then operational launches next year. Firefly in Austin, Texas is another one. And then Generation Orbit has a Gulfstream that they've retrofitted to fit an air-launched rocket on the bottom of. Stratolaunch, which I think is probably furthest out, I'm not sure. But another air-launch concept that's much, much bigger. And they have some exciting ideas to launch to wherever you want to go in the future. And then I have the Tricept Corporation Phantom Ride on ESPAs included on this chart because what you're seeing is these secondary integrators are now talking about booking full rockets. So they're going to book an entire Falcon 9 and then resell that to 100 customers. So that's a lot of capacity they can give to secondaries. It'll be like the equivalent of booking an airplane ride. Every 2 years they'll buy a Falcon 9 and you can get to space on that Falcon 9. So just to give you an idea of the amount of launch opportunities, making it possible for companies like Spire to actually field an entire constellation. Last year there were 92 orbital launches worldwide. And I estimated that out of all the LEO launches, 32 of them could have taken our CubeSats to LEO. So when Peter says I have to book a launch every single month, we know it's possible. It's going to be very difficult, but that's our plan, is to book a launch every single month. Like I showed you before, the Walker Constellation versus throwing 2 CubeSats on every single launch, that really does provide the most resilient launch plan. It protects you against schedule slips, failures, like we've seen recently. So moving forward, that's going to be our plan. So if you are a launch company in the room and you have any space in the next 2 years, let's talk. And I think that's it. So I'm available for questions, if you have any.
Hi, my name is Jay, involved in small launch vehicles startups. Do you sort of have, for your satellite design, a max sort of like acceleration loads or any kind of specific requirements that are specific to your satellite design that launch providers sort of need to start designing their rockets to?
Good question. So we've been riding secondary on larger rockets, so it's something we're going to have to look at. I would be shocked if there was anything on our satellites that couldn't withstand higher loads. But any small launcher company is going to have to work with CubeSat or small sat companies to make sure that that's addressed. Right.
So sort of my guess is that larger rockets are designed for larger payloads, which have very, very demanding requirements. But I feel like small satellites are smaller and probably more resilient, handle a lot more than the small launchers can sort of have more wiggle room and less strict requirements, which could contribute to cost.
Right. And it's a small package. It has minimal moving parts. We have deployable solar arrays and antennas, but they are cheap to build, cheap to launch. So we spend a lot of money trying to protect against higher acceleration. We're going to do some math on some paper and call it a.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay, thanks. One of my questions is, how are you guys dealing with international entities, since I see that you guys are working from 3 different countries? How does that affect your business, and what are the main problems, or what are the main achievements of doing so?
I think more than anything, it's been positive. From a satellite operations standpoint, we can have people in 3 time zones operating satellites, which will be a huge relief to our ops team in San Francisco right now. We can attract talent from places like India and Asia, which have talent, many times over than in the United States. Same in the UK. We're finding a lot of interest in our UK location. And yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits. I think the only downside of getting our team out is this fear that our company culture of being this one team in a room, having a great time together and learning from each other is kind of more spread. So we do have telepresence set up in our office. When you walk in, there's a big screen from Singapore and a big screen from Glasgow. So different times of the day, the lights will come on in one office or shut down in another, but you can constantly walk by and say hi. You know, we'll be having a Friday lunch meeting, and the Glasgow office will be drinking, and you know, people are doing cartwheels past the camera. But I think that's the challenge, is keeping it one cohesive. I don't think there's been any real pitfalls at this point.
Can you share with us what kind of measurement or instrumentation you have on your payload?
Yes, I should have definitely mentioned that. It's GPS radio occultation. So we're just taking advantage of all the GPS satellite signals as they come. If you're not familiar, as those signals come into the atmosphere, they will bend and that's a relationship based on the temperature, pressure, humidity of the atmosphere. So you can actually look at those signals bending and compute weather information. Yep. Not sending down large data files of images, it's numbers, which is great. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. And now this concludes the sessions for today. The BPC Open House is now open. It is in the Sierra Room off to where the lunchrooms are. Enjoy, and we'll